Welcome to the left twist cutting and sewing instructions for the Infinity Twist Quilt-Along. First of all, you'll need the focus fabric 8.5 by 8.5, the rectangle for the first twist 3.5 by 14.5, and the second twist 3.5 by 17.5. You need 2 of each of those rectangles. I also like to print out my labels and keep them labeled. So the first step, I always like to make sure that I have the rectangles together right sides up, because if you don't do this, you'll cut the triangles the wrong angle. I also like to make sure that I keep everything labeled, as I have experiences that if I don't keep them labeled, I mix up the left and the right triangles, and this helps me keep myself organized. Now, this is the most important step for ensuring you have your twist going the right direction. You actually cut on the left twist from the bottom right up to the top left, like this. And that'll make sure that you have your 90-degree angle of the triangle in the right direction. And we do the same for the second one, bottom right to top left, and you end up with 4 triangles for each of the twist fabric. Now let's start the sewing process. I keep everything that I need together, and I start with my first triangle. I line it up with the focus fabric where the 90-degree angle of the triangle matches the 90-degree angle of the focus fabric. Here I just make sure that everything is lined up so you'll have a better result. And then the first thing you need to make sure what you do here is you just do a partial seam. I leave about maybe 1.5 inches at the end. Just like this. And for the first seam, I just kind of press with my fingers just to make sure that when we're adding in the second triangle, that when the part that we're going sewing over the seam fits properly. I don't sew the full seam until we complete the full seam at the very end. So again, line up. And so this time we sew all the way to the end. There will be tail at the end, but you don't have to sew all the way right down to the end, but just make sure that you're at the end of the first triangle. There you go. Still a little bit left, but you can stop just there. Magic ironing going on there, and now I turn again, 90-degree angle turn, and sew triangle number 3 on. And again, this one, seam all the way down. Magic power of my ironing again. And now this is why we do the partial seam. As you see here, when we're putting on the 4th triangle, we need to have that space, so we keep that bit out of the way from the first triangle, the end piece, and then we just line this up and ensure that we're not catching the long piece from the first triangle. And again, we sew it right down to the end of where the fabrics need to meet. You'll have a little bit extra, but we'll cut that off soon. Then we'll do a quick iron of that, and now we come back to finish off the partial seam. And what I tend to do here is when I'm placing the block in, I move back about 1.5 inches back further up for where I've sewed already, and make sure that, and I bring my needle down that it's exactly on top of the stitches that were there already, and then I basically just sew off to the end. And this is the point where I will do a proper pressing of that final seam. And now we trim it up to 11.5 by 11.5. And then we do fast motion of doing the exact same thing over again with the second twist. Do a partial seam and then turn in 90-degree angles and sew them on iron. Next one on, sew on down, turn, we sew the, oops, I think I used my seam ripper there. And then sew the last one, the fourth one on, and then we finish off that same partial seam. Important thing to notice here when cutting is the places where I have the X shown here. You have to make sure that there's at least an inch available around here. And here's the final left twist block. And the one thing I'm marking here is you see this just pink dots. I just want to make you aware that the block is correct if the tails of the triangles are on the same side of the block, if that makes sense. So there you are. Now go off and make as many more blocks as you want. I'll have another video soon to show you just the slight differences that are done for the right twists.